The Pentagon is putting renewed focus on the mental health needs of military personnel who've engaged in combat in Iraq and Afghanistan. This at a time when increased numbers of war vets are dealing with depression and post-traumatic stress disorder and, sadly, contemplating suicide. Joining us now, retired Vice Admiral Norbert Ryan of the U.S. Navy. He is president of the Military Officers Association of America. We are delighted to have you. Thanks very much for coming in.
Good to be here, Bruce.
It is good to see this issue getting the attention it deserves. Sad, of course, that so many men come back from the battlefield unable to make the clean break one would hope, perhaps unrealistically, that they could make. But to the extent that there is a problem, that the war follows them home, in my phrase, that the care should be there to the maximum extent possible.
Absolutely. That's why the Military Officers Association and our partners, U.S. Naval Institute, have had this defense forum for 3 years in a row. Everyone would agree, Bruce, that we've made some progress, but no one is satisfied. The numbers are staggering when you think of a war going on for 8 years in two fronts, with less than 1/2% of the population doing the fighting for the other 330 million of us. You're going to have these problems, and the fact that they have to keep going back to the war 3 and 4 times. I've been to Iraq now the last 3 years in a row, and I see the same troops over there. The troops are lucky, the ground forces, if they're spending 6 or 7 months out of 36 months under the same roof as their family. So that is just exacerbating what we always know happens in a war.
You've sort of anticipated my next question, but let's talk about it in a little more detail. To what extent are the second tour, third tour, more if there are more, a factor as opposed to a more traditional length of service? I mean, the repeated dealing with death, with violence, with the very real sense that a deadly enemy could be around the corner.
Right. We've always had post-traumatic stress. We just recognized it in the 1980s when Veterans Affairs recognized it, but that has always been a condition of war, one of the terrible results of war. But what has added fuel to the fire is the fact that these young men and women, who are another greatest generation in uniform, Bruce, as you well know, even the strongest and the greatest can only bear so much. And so each time that they go back, the percentage risk of getting either post-traumatic stress, traumatic brain injury, or depression increase to the point where we estimate that roughly 1/3 of the 1.7 million men and women who have gone to Iraq or Afghanistan have either a combination of or one of those conditions that require mental health and other types of doctor help.
I suspect folks at home know what we mean by depression from their own experience, or a loved one or a friend, what have you. But can you talk about what the experience of living with post-traumatic stress disorder is like? I mean, how does that manifest on a daily basis in someone's life when they're back home?
Well, for post-traumatic stress, for the individual, of course, being able to function, to have a quality of life with repeated flashbacks of the incidences that she or he experienced. So it goes to the daily quality of living of the member, of the family, of the units that they're involved with. And then, of course, when we get into the severe cases of post-traumatic stress, it ends up in things like homelessness, suicide, self-medication, all those terrible things that happen when you don't diagnose properly and treat quickly. The good news is if you can diagnose it and treat it, most of these young men and women can get well, get better.
Let me, before we go any farther, give out the phone number so folks at home can join our conversation. If you have any experience with or concerns about, or just want to ask a question or make a comment as we continue to talk about the mental effects of war, join us by calling 703-387-1020. Lines open for afternoon viewers to join our conversation today here on News Talk. Again, our number, 387-1020, area code 703. Grab an open line now. I'd love to hear from you, and we'll go to the phones as your questions and comments come in. To what extent has there been a cultural shift required of the Pentagon and perhaps folks who volunteer to fight in our armed forces to recognize the legitimacy of mental health problems as opposed to a physical body injury, that it's not a sign of weakness or any of that other bunk from the olden days, but something to be dealt with straight on?
Great question, Bruce, and I give our leadership credit, starting with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and the Joint Chiefs themselves. Admiral Mike Mullen will be there to speak at our forum tomorrow because he and his wife Deborah feel so passionately about this. Trying to break down the stigma is the main problem with our magnificent men and women. There's still too many of them that feel that this may be a sign that they're weak. And of course we know just the opposite. So breaking down that stigma is an important thing. We feel only about 50% of the folks that experience post-traumatic stress, and many of our flag and general officers have been brave enough to say, yes, I experienced it, whether it was in Vietnam or in another era. Leadership is taking a big role in this, and certainly Secretary Shinseki at the Veterans Affairs is also taking a lead in this. We'll have leaders from both of those organizations, including Admiral Mullen speaking, along with Senator McCain tomorrow, who will address the subject, and then 3 working panels, all talking about we need to destigmatize this, we need to break down the barriers then for these hundreds of thousands of folks that are going to need or do need counseling and help. And so that's another challenge, that we need to get more mental health workers both in the civilian and military area to work those issues. And then finally, the families are victims of this as well, and so we need to do a lot more for the families.
Well, you anticipated my next question. By the way, Stephen in Gaithersburg, stay on the line. I'm going to go to your call in just a moment. Stephen, stand by, please. In terms of recognizing that there might be a problem, I mean, of course, someone who sees violence, is involved in violence, that constant fear, that knowledge that something extremely dangerous for yourself and the folks you're serving with could be just around the corner. To what extent do families play a role in recognizing the problem and then encouraging their loved one to pursue help?
Huge. And that was one of the problems that has come out in one of our earlier forums that MOA and the U.S. Naval Institute have sponsored. And that is, one of the spouses said, I recognized, she had a degree in psychology, when my husband came home, he was different. And unfortunately, early on in the war, the services were not tuned in enough and working with the families enough and involving them. And that is one of the key takeaways, is we've got to involve the families. Their education is important too, and we need to give them a lot more assistance.
I want to get to as many calls as we can, starting on line 1. Stephen in Gaithersburg, hello. You're on the air.
Hello. Thank you very much for having this man on the show. I am a former Marine, but I'm also a psychologist. And post-traumatic stress disorder, I didn't know I had suffered with it until I went to see a psychiatrist. And I was telling him that I kept replaying things in my mind, trying to change them, trying to make it better, the things that I had went through. And we didn't know what was wrong with me. They thought that I was suffering from bipolar disorder, ADHD. But the thing about it is, when I'm dealing with my patients now, the thing about it is there is not enough education given to the